It's been a while since I've taken a look at a retro emulation handheld from a small company like Retroid. It was back in November of 2022 when I took a look at the Retroid Pocket 3 just a few months after it had come out, and was rightfully annoyed that the 3 Plus was already available for purchase when I uploaded my video.
One, because the day I'm f***ing filming this video, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus comes out. Cool.
But it wasn't just me that was annoyed. Retroid was going through a very rough patch during that point in time, doing things like releasing way too many hardware revisions one after another, the company having way too many faulty devices and QC issues, and expecting you, the customer, to fix those issues with parts they throw in the box. But somehow, through all of that, the Retroid Pocket 3 and especially 3 Plus were some of the best value for money retro emulation handhelds on the market at that time. And somehow, I stand in front of this camera again to tell you that the Retroid Pocket 5 is still one of the best choices for budget Android emulation, even if Retroid's products aren't as budget as they used to be. Retroid's unboxings haven't really changed over the past few years, with the Retroid Pocket 5 being almost the exact same unboxing experience as my 2 Plus and 3. Inside the box, you'll get the Retroid Pocket 5 itself, a user guide, a USB A to C charging and data cable, and that's it. One thing I do want to mention is how that box got to me. Previously, when I ordered my Retroid Pocket 2 Plus and 3, I'd picked the cheapest shipping through 4px, and that gave me a similar shopping experience to something like AliExpress or Wish, where sure it would get to me, but it would take a long time. I splurged the extra $15 for DHL shipping this time around, and if you're able to, I cannot recommend it enough. My Retroid arrived in under a week from China to Australia. Another thing I do want to note about the purchase process is make sure you're not using a VPN. I had a VPN accidentally connected to a server in Melbourne when I am in Sydney, and had my order cancelled because it was flagged as fraud in their systems. Luckily, customer service was able to respond, let me know exactly what happened, and after the refund cleared in my account in about 3 days, I was able to reorder with no issues. Setting up Retroid's devices have traditionally been a very simple experience, especially compared to other Android handhelds like the Odin or some of Ambinick's Android offerings. And a good chunk of this is because of the custom setup that Retroid implements, instead of just using the stock Android one, with additional options like whether you want to disable Google Play services, and particularly whether you want to install emulators that Retroid suggests. They've been doing this for a long time, which you can tell because the Play services option was implemented to improve performance on their older handhelds. And while a good chunk of the emulators included in this setup are decent enough, I'd recommend downloading them from the Play Store if you can, especially if you're an advanced user or if you're setting this up for someone else. These built-in emulators are almost certainly fine for the older systems like GBA, or even some of the older 3D systems like Nintendo 64. But emulators for newer systems like PlayStation 2 and especially close to or current gen consoles like the Nintendo Switch and the 3DS are going to be much more up to date compared to what's included in the setup screen, which almost certainly will improve performance and add some extra quality of life features. I ended up just going through and downloading most of the emulators from the Play Store, particularly because I have paid versions of Movement 64 and Drastic, which add some extra useful features, and the paid versions of those apps are also something that I would recommend if you're able to grab those. If you're an Android user, by the way, you can use the same Google account, so buying them on your Retroid, for example, would also give you access to those emulators on your Android phone. Even with the outdated emulators in mind, Retroid's setup is still much simpler than other Android devices. I did run into this slight hiccup of having to manually register the Google services on my device before I could properly use Google Play and download my paid apps, but that only took me about a minute or so to get set up, and I haven't run into that issue before on my other Retroid devices, so I'm going to assume it was a fluke. Part of Retroid's simpler approach to Android is the company's natively built game launcher, but I'll get more into that and some other options later in the video because I have some thoughts. Why am I so high up? That's better. Now you can see my hands. Back onto the hardware for a bit, Retroid's handhelds have been significantly improving in their build quality and overall feel, especially since my first Retroid device, the Pocket 2 Plus. This one. The Retroid Pocket 5 has a slight amount of heft to it that doesn't make it uncomfortable to use or unwieldy to carry in a pocket, but just enough to where it has a more premium feel in the hand, which is further assisted by the grips that are molded into the backplate of the device for a more ergonomic feel that makes it feel like it's just melting into your hands, especially compared to the Retroid Pocket 3, and I would assume 4, but I haven't personally owned the 4, and I'm purely going off photos here. The analog sticks on this device are incredibly smooth, which really shocked me. These sticks are on par in smoothness, access to some devices from first-party companies like Valve and Microsoft with the Steam Deck and Xbox wireless controller respectively, but with a lower profile, and they completely smashed the Nintendo Switch Joy-Con analog sticks out of the water. They are Hall effect sticks too, like the Retroid Pocket 4, which seems to be everyone's favorite buzzword for controllers and handhelds now. Essentially what that means is they should reduce the possibility of stick drift in the future by using magnets to calculate the movement instead of physical contact. They do stick out a little bit from the screen, but not enough to prevent it from sliding into a pocket without having fabric catch onto them. But you may want to watch out in case your leg is at a weird angle. That might, I don't know how else to explain this, but I had one of the caps snap off the actual stick mechanism when I had it in my pocket at work once. Now, granted, you aren't very likely to be working at a grocery store self-checkout with this in your pocket, so you'll probably be fine. Thankfully, the caps do just snap straight back on and they feel good as new. If you happen to lose one of the joystick caps or if one of them fails, Retroid does sell replacement joystick assemblies, which is a great thing to do. The RGB joysticks are a very nice touch and look really great with the diffusion layer in front of them, but the customization options are pretty limited in the stock operating system. The app Emulation, which costs either $2 Australian a month or $10 Australian for a lifetime license, does give you more options like animated color cycles or ambient lighting based on the content on screen to kind of emulate the LED strips that can go behind a monitor, but I can't really justify a $10 purchase for cooler animations. You can trial it for 10 minutes for free, so you can play around with it and just kind of see if you would like it, and they don't limit the amount of times you can activate the trial, but realistically, you're not going to be jumping between a game and the Emulation app every 2 minutes, so you'll want to pay for it if you plan on actually using it. The custom Linux OS Rocknix does also include more built-in options for lighting, but I'll talk more about that option later. The buttons all feel great, but they're a mixed bag in terms of the way they feel, which is not a negative statement, by the way. The D-pad is clicky, more similar to something like a DSi or a Switch Joy-Con with the outline shape of a DualSense controller, but with the buttons unified. It's a bit... that didn't really make as much sense as I wanted it to. The face buttons are a rubber membrane, kind of like a Switch Lite, but with more travel and a nicer overall actuation. The analog triggers remain from the Retroid Pocket 4, which is really nice for both modern emulation and for native Android games and cloud streaming. I forgot about that one. All of which I'll talk about in the performance section of the video. The start, select, home, back, etc. all have a very clicky feel, closer to something like a mouse click, and as a former Retroid Pocket 3 user, it is very nice to see them return to the front of the device instead of the sides, because why were they ever there in the first place, Retroid? That was fixed on the 4, but again, I've never personally owned one, so it is good to see here. When you're actually playing games, there is even active cooling here that spins up when it needs to. By default, when you turn it to high performance modes, which you'll probably want to do for more advanced emulation and modern Android games, the fan defaults to just ramp up to 100% and stay there, which does get very whiny and very loud. If you're in like a very quiet room, you won't want to be using that. What you will want to do is set the fan curve to smart mode, which actually has a fan curve that ramps up when it needs to cool down. From my experiences using high performance mode and smart fan curve, the fan very rarely ramps up, and when it's not at full blast, it's very quiet when it does. I've personally never actually heard it ramp up to that max speed while I'm playing a game. Taking a look at the aesthetics, I've got the black one here, and I really wish the transparent from the Pocket 4 was available as a factory color scheme instead of a backplate that you have to install yourself and that is sold separately. I don't regret the black, especially seeing as the 60Hz 1080p AMOLED display just melts into the glass front when you're playing 4x3 games that don't stretch to take up the whole screen. But it is an absolute fingerprint magnet, similar to the PS Vita that shares the same color, and realistically exactly the same as every dark colored piece of tech. Look, Apple couldn't figure out how to get rid of them on the midnight MacBook Air. I really don't expect Retroid to either. And as a side note, while I'm talking about the screen, a higher refresh rate would have been cool for Android games, even just 90, but 60 is just fine. There are other colors here too, so if fingerprints are a massive deal breaker for you, they are almost certainly not going to be as noticeable on the other options, all of which are lighter colors. Retroid also sells vinyl skins in a much wider range of color options than the actual handheld itself, although Reddit comments seem to show that they aren't great quality, with imprecise cuts and blurry designs, and they seem to be a bit overall inconsistent. Considering that they are $5 US, I wouldn't be expecting a D-brand quality skin if you grab one one of these. If they sponsored me, that would be a great segue because I do love D-Brand. Hit me up, please. While I wrap up the section for build quality and hardware, I do want to point out that Retroid is slightly notorious for very bad quality control, especially if you're an early adopter. I haven't personally noticed any QC issues, but it definitely is something you'll want to watch out for. If I remember correctly, Bob from Wolfden had some QC issues with his Pocket 5 and had a bit of a nightmare over time contacting customer support. So I'll leave a link to that video down below as well if you want more details on that. And he's got a great review as well, so if you want multiple opinions, which you should get, yeah, go check him out. I'm sure you know Wolfden if you're watching me. Like I mentioned earlier, Retroid typically bundles a pretty decent launcher with their handhelds. In the past few generations, Retroid's kept it simple, with a launcher that sort of mimics the Nintendo Switch UI, and yeah, it worked really well, automatically creating folder structures, scraping all of your box art, and even downloading RetroArch cores pretty seamlessly. Retroid's launcher still, as far as I can tell, does all of this, but the look and feel just isn't as nice as it was before, and the UX just seems to be completely off compared to the older one. Again, Bob from Wolfden seemed to have an issue on both his Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini, where it just straight up didn't work. Mine does work, and it does have some nice additions, like how it changes the joystick color based on the system you're looking at. But I personally much prefer Digishell, I hope I said that right, for my Android handhelds, and I've preferred it since it launched around the time I had my Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. Since then, it's gotten much better with wallpaper and system art support and a built-in downloader for the latter, more options for filtering Android apps and games, better scraping, etc. And on top of all that, it's free. It's a bit more complicated to set up and it takes a bit longer, particularly because you have to set up the paths manually and scrape each system individually, but it is absolutely worth it once you have it set up. There's a few other popular options for game launchers. I tried Beacon for $5 which looks really pretty, but the setup is even more time consuming compared to Digishell and especially compared to Retroid's launcher. And the scraping just straight up doesn't really work nearly as well as either of those options. But it does have a ton of options for customization and it does in fact launch your games, so I'll give it that. Emulation Station also now has an Android version that is again slightly more difficult to set up, but can look excellent and works really well. Emulation Station runs on EmuDeck. If you've used the Steam Deck for emulation, it runs on most Linux-based handhelds, like I don't have many, but the classic RG351P for example, so you'll be right at home with Emulation Station if you're upgrading from one of those. If you're unhappy with the native Android OS and the launcher options there, you can also use the custom OS Rocknix to launch your games and get some other features. Rocknix, as far as I can tell, runs entirely off the SD card and doesn't touch Android, so you can dual boot it with the version of Android 13 it comes with. And it gives you an OS and an experience more in tune with Linux-based handhelds, because that's essentially what it turns your Retroid into. You'll get the Emulation Station front end with pre-configured emulators all ready to go, even up to light PS3 and original Xbox, which aren't available on Android. But you do lose access to the benefits of Android, particularly Android games and the Google ecosystem if you're into that. One of the features I think I would miss is that the earbuds I use with my Z Fold automatically paired to my Retroid straight away, which was just so nice. And if you'd like to learn more about those earbuds, I don't have them here. If you would like to learn more about them, you can check out my review of the CMF Buds Pro 2 up in one of the corners. Unlike in Rocknix and other Linux handhelds, emulators in Android do need a little bit of tinkering to get them working properly before you can just open them up in the front end and start gaming, even with the automatic configuration Retroid attempts to do in the launcher. I'd recommend going into each emulator outside of your front end before you attempt to actually play anything. That way you're able to configure all of the file permissions and controller bindings and have a more seamless experience when you're in your front end of choice. Android is particularly annoying with file permissions and setups, which makes sense on a phone where you're actually storing, important files, but not so much on a gaming handheld. Considering that even large companies like Razer and Logitech are making Android handhelds, it could be cool to see a version of Android optimized for gaming devices, but I'm getting ahead of myself. After everything's configured correctly, you won't really be seeing many issues here. In my personal experience, after everything was configured, my games launch with absolutely no issues from Digishell, and I very rarely have to go into the emulator itself. When I do, it's mainly to tinker with specific game settings to get them to run a little bit nicer. And speaking of running games nicer, absolutely nothing I just said matters if the games run like shit. And luckily, they don't. Retroid has traditionally had pretty great performance on their devices, and the Pocket 5 just brings it to a new level. Considering it's got a Snapdragon 865 SoC in here with 8 cores, 8GB of LPDDR4 RAM, and an Adreno 650 GPU, it runs things well. Like, very well. Basically, the only thing above this in terms of performance are devices from AYN like the Odin. but when you get into that price range, well, you may as well just go Steam Deck. If you're looking for a quick summary, the Pocket 5 in my experiences runs up to GameCube and PS2 with essentially zero issues. I forgot to take it out of the control center, but this has been running a PS2 game the entire time. And as a bonus, it can even run a small selection of Nintendo Switch, Wii, and Wii U games as well. If you decide to throw Rocknix on here, you're getting a small sliver of original Xbox and PS3 too. As you'd expect, Android games and cloud streaming also work essentially perfectly, with the latter being assisted by the Wi-Fi 6 support. Over the next few minutes, I'll get into some more detail with performance, and I'll be showing some uninterrupted gameplay. If you're not into that, check out the chapters on the progress bar below for pricing info and my overall thoughts. Alright, so you're a nerd. Starting with the easiest thing that basically anything with a decent internet connection can run, cloud streaming. It obviously works great here. Basically any cloud streaming service works well, with the only real caveat being that Xbox Game Pass requires a third-party app called Better xCloud, as the official Game Pass app just doesn't work on this device for whatever reason, not even once it's been sideloaded. But honestly, Better xCloud is, as you'd guess, better. And now that I know it exists because of the Retroid, I'd probably recommend it even on standard phones and other devices. Streaming works pretty reliably, and I didn't notice any major network issues or graphical issues on my, albeit very good, home network. In this B-roll with Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart streaming from my PC, it gives a really nice demo of the analog triggers, considering some weapons use half presses of the right trigger to perform different actions, like half pressing to trigger the shield on the Void Repulsor and full pressing to fire it. For Cloud and Dreamcast, I recorded audio samples from the built-in speakers through my microphone, but everything else has audio captured over line-in to kind of give an idea of audio performance without being hindered by the speakers themselves.
Ooh. Whoopsies.
Note that as I get into performance of the things actually running on the device itself, I was using the high performance mode with the fan set to smart. Android games also work flawlessly. The only testing game I couldn't get to run was Zenless Zone Zero, solely because my account just straight up didn't log in. But considering the other performance tests here, I'm pretty confident saying that it would almost definitely run. In COD Mobile, I was running at an essentially locked 60 FPS with medium graphical settings at max frame rate. And you could easily crank graphics up if you wanted to take a small hit on FPS. The only real caveat here is that the game doesn't have full controller support in the menus, which doesn't matter if you're using it on the handheld itself, considering that it is a touchscreen, but it might not be a great time if you're docked up to a TV. The game also only displays PlayStation controller graphics, but Retroid can't really do much about that.
Predator missile awaiting orders. Enemy down. Taking the lead.
Fortnite is another shooter game that thankfully works on Android internationally, unlike the EU region lock on iPhone. And again, it runs really nicely here, even in the heavier game modes. In OG, Reload, and other lighter modes, you'll be getting a very stable 60 FPS, and the full Battle Royale mode will have you looking at between 40 to 60 frames. Sky Children of the Light is an absolutely beautiful mobile game that I highly recommend trying out for just a bit to look at it. And it runs flawlessly on the Retroid Pocket 5 with both frame rate and graphical settings put to max. This game really pops on the AMOLED screen, and it's nice to see it running this well here. Getting into emulation now, if you see any random blurs on the screen, it's probably because Nintendo decided to have a go at me. I didn't do much testing on the older systems because obviously it's going to work considering the amount of power this has. It passes the SNES Yoshi's Island test with flying colors, and even more intensive SNES games like Star Fox ran with no issues. Moving straight into the 3D generation here, Nintendo 64 runs really well. I did pick some very hard games here to try to push the RP5, and the only game I really had issues with was Mario Tennis, which is notoriously difficult to accurately emulate. It had the standard issues you'd expect here, with some of the special effects just simply not rendering correctly, but it does run at full speed and it is technically playable. The other games I tested, Perfect Dark and F-Zero X, ran at full speed and about as you'd expect, only really having stutters and performance issues that would occur on actual hardware in Perfect Dark and a flawless 60 FPS in F-Zero X.
My gun!
One of the benefits of having a touchscreen device is using Nintendo DS emulation. You can actually play games as they're intended. And that system, as you'd expect, works flawlessly here. I used the paid emulated Drastic here, which is only, I think, about $7 Australian. I bought it a while ago. I'll put an updated price on screen here, and it is one of the best DS emulators for Android, and I'd highly recommend picking it up. It does have performance improvements for less powerful systems, so if you're running on something like a Retroid Pocket 3 or 2 Plus, which is, fun fact, where I beat Super Mario Bros. DS for the first time, but realistically on the 5 you'd probably be fine with something like Melon DS, which is free. Both Mario Kart DS and Animal Crossing Wild World ran without issues with high resolution rendering and with full touch support. Straight onto systems that might actually present a challenge, we're onto GameCube, and the Pocket 5 rips through these games with no issues. I know I just said no issues, but the only real issue I did run into here mainly had to do with the shader compilation and having it occasionally stutter, which is just kind of a problem that we haven't really figured out to fix at all just yet with most modern 3D systems. I had the same issues running new GameCube games on my Steam Deck. These stutters gradually reduce as you play the game more. I did also have a weird issue, I shouldn't have said no issues. I did also have a weird issue with Metroid Prime where the triggers seemed swapped for some reason, even when I went in and rebinded the controls, but it was absolutely flawless in terms of performance. I used Dolphin for handheld here, which does have some built-in performance optimizations, particularly not letting you go past 1x native resolution. You might be able to get some nicer looking visuals using Dolphin or Dolphin MMJR and turning on upscaling, but I didn't exactly have any issues with how the games looked here, so I decided to just leave it. This is a system where the analog triggers come into play really nicely, particularly in Super Mario Sunshine. I tested two emulators for Dreamcast here, both Flycast and Redream, mostly because I prefer Redream's UI and polish, but it lacks some graphical features behind a paywall like upscaling, so I tested that on Flycast. On Redream, I had a bit of a run through Crazy Taxi at the standard settings with native resolution, and it ran at a buttery smooth 60 FPS.
You're okay. Get in.
Watch it, you nearly took me to the cable car.
Okay, hang on.
Go straight.
Just shut up and let's go.
Go straight.
Yeah, I know. Coming next day.
In Flycast, I played through a couple of tutorial levels of Jet Grind Radio at 1200p resolution, and it stayed locked at the game's native 30 FPS. I hate to sound like a broken record here, but PS2 also runs shockingly well using Nether SX2 here. I tried a bunch of different graphical settings and they all worked perfectly, even when I tried out the widescreen patch in The Simpsons Hit and Run. Nether SX2 takes some extra work to get running, but it's well worth it over using an older version of Aether SX2, which used to be the best PS2 emulator on Android and even Apple Silicon Mac, but it had some weird ad stuff and other interesting features that were added after the project was shut down, notably reducing performance. I'm not going to go into that much further. Nether patches all of this out of Aether SX2 and it leads to a really great experience overall. They've got a pretty simple guide on their GitHub for setting it up. You can patch an APK on a computer, on your Android device itself, basically whatever. If you're more of a visual learner, Retro Game Core also has a video tutorial that I'll link below. Russ, if by some stroke of luck you're watching this, I blame you for my addiction to these things, and I couldn't be happier.
Here's another chance to practice your face-off skills. Get ready and watch for the referee to drop the puck, then press the X button. Scores! I am in total disbelief at how little skill was required for that goal. Their way out a bit and showing only minor signs of extended burial, aren't it?
Joe second. The goal.
Elias grabbed it.
Oh yeah, stretch the legs and the crotch. Hey, Apu, give me a cola and I need...
Congratulations, Homer. Mission complete. Go back home and talk to Mom to start the next mission.
And here's where we get into the bonus systems. You should not buy the Retroid Pocket 5 specifically to play these, but if you've got an urge to try them out or have even just one game that you know will work and you'd like to have on here, then yeah, it runs. Starting with Nintendo Wii, this is probably the most reliable out of the bonus systems, considering the Wii is just a more powerful GameCube. Performance here is fine, but basically any Wii game that needs a Wiimote is going to be a bad experience, particularly as Dolphin for Handheld doesn't even let you map physical controls. To a Wiimote, you would need a physical remote and a Dolphin bar or some other sensor bar to actually play them. And that's why I couldn't test Super Mario Galaxy here. Mario Kart Wii, on the other hand, supports GameCube controls and works very well at a solid 60 FPS with full native widescreen support. Now the next two are actually bonus systems. Don't expect any of these games to run well unless you've seen them work well and expect them to break. Wii U runs surprisingly decently in the games that do work, and the built-in motion controls on the Pocket 5 do assist with playing these. I tried to run Breath of the Wild, but it requires a system and game update that I can't seem to get installed on the build of CMU that I used for Android, which is a shame. I tried out Mario Kart 8, which worked flawlessly, aside from the stutters during shader compilations, which are to be expected. Now, the game that did kind of disappoint me was Splatoon. I love Splatoon, so when I saw that the graphics were bugged out, the motion controls were completely f***ed, and the game crashed every few minutes, it was a bit sad. Somehow the Switch runs better than Wii U. I don't know how, but still consider it as a bonus. The system also needs a lot more tinkering to work properly, but once it's set up, it works shockingly well, which means you can finally take your Switch games on the go. Perfect for the guy who doesn't realize that you can do that. Animal Crossing New Horizons initially refused to work in Sudachi, which is probably the emulator that you should actually use. But a previous build of Yuzu ran it almost perfectly with the turned 24.3.0 graphics drivers at 1x resolution and async shaders at the native 30 FPS that it runs at. Luckily, Daijishou at least will let you configure certain games to run in specific emulators, so I just set Animal Crossing to run in Yuzu and everything else in Sudachi. Pokemon Violet works in Sudachi and tends to run anywhere between 25 to 30 FPS, occasionally dropping below 25 in scenes with more action or more scenery. There are occasional graphical glitches, and it did crash on my first launch, but it worked great afterwards. Echoes of Wisdom was interesting. It did run, I guess, getting between 30 and 60 FPS with occasional stutters, but a lot of the entities in the first scene at least don't render correctly at all, and some of their attacks are entirely invisible, making the game essentially unplayable. Unlike everything else I tested, turnip drivers made the game crash entirely, but standard Qualcomm drivers allowed it to actually load into the game. Finally, I tested Kirby in the Forgotten Land, and it ran very well at around 20 to 30 FPS and some stutters during shader comp. This is not a challenging game, so playing at a slightly lower frame rate is absolutely possible. Personally, I haven't tested these, nor have I even installed Rocknix, but they seem to work pretty decently in lighter games, with Xbox even running some of the Halo games at playable frame rates. I'll leave some performance tests in the description below for those. Recent developments in Android gaming have also allowed for certain PC games through Steam to run natively on mobile devices, which is incredible. But in the time I've had to work on this video, I haven't gotten around to trying it myself. Again, I'll leave a couple more videos in the description if you're more interested in that. If you're not a nerd, welcome back. Like I mentioned in the intro, Retroid devices are getting pricey. But this isn't just because they feel like it. They are truly getting much better with most revisions and providing even more value. The Retroid Pocket 5 comes in at $219 for the base model, which is the only configuration, unlike the Retroid Pocket 4 before it, which had a Pro model and different SKUs for each of those. If you want something smaller, you can also grab the Retroid Pocket Mini, which comes in at $200. The only hardware difference here that would impact performance is the 6 gigs of RAM instead of 8 gigs, but it should perform mostly the same, especially in emulation. There is also a 4x3 screen, so if you're looking to use widescreen patches or most Android games, probably go for the 5. Although as of writing, the Mini is completely sold out, so you're kind of stuck with this for now. If you're a real baller who wants both the Mini and the 5, Retroid offers a bundle deal that prices both of them for $399 instead of the $418 it would cost to buy them individually. Personally, I believe that if you are the type to buy two versions of what is essentially the same handheld, $20 probably isn't the deciding factor, but hey, it's there. To wrap this up, this handheld is excellent. It plays basically any Android game you could ever want, dominates for cloud cloud gaming emulates up to GameCube and PS2 with no issues and reaches up to Nintendo Switch and looks damn good doing all of it. The only real concern I have with recommending it are the QC issues that do occur way too often on Retroid devices. But these usually iron out in production after a few months into the lifespan, and my lack of any sort of issues mostly cancels out my nerves there. Just know that if you do have issues, it is a slight gamble whether customer support will actually be useful. If you're an absolute beginner, you'd probably be better with something running Linux from Ambernick or another company, I mean. These usually have everything pre-configured and ready to go. But if you know even a little bit of what you're doing and you know how to set up emulators on Android or PC, other devices, I cannot recommend this enough. Thanks for watching, hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, you should go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button to help support the channel and get notified when I make even more videos just like this one. You can follow me over on Instagram, Blue Sky, and everything else with the links on screen and in the description below. There's even a community-run Discord server you can join as well if you want some more direct interactions with me and the community. If you want more handheld content, you can check out my modern review of the Nintendo DSi, or you can click over here to check out whatever YouTube thinks you'll like. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. I'm gonna go play The Simpsons Hit and Run now, it's been way too tempting.
Also, just as a side note, this is probably the last video that's going to be edited on the M2 MacBook Air, so, you know, everyone say bye-bye MacBook Air in the comments.